Sunset over the Black City. The city of Cape Azure, a dazzling gem in the heart of Africa, bathed in golden sunlight as the hustle and bustle of urban life carried on. Towering skyscrapers housed the wealthiest elites, while narrow streets brimmed with mechanics, traders, and hard-working laborers striving for a better future. In a small, aging auto repair shop on the outskirts of the city, a young man named Elijah Mwangi spent his summer working tirelessly. Born into a poor family, Elijah had never allowed his circumstances to dictate his dreams. He had just been accepted into Cape Azure Technical University, but instead of celebrating, he chose to work. His hands, often covered in oil and grease, were a testament to his dedication, and his sharp mind held ambitions far beyond the confines of his small garage. As the evening sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the bustling streets, a sleek Bentley Continental GT suddenly stalled in the middle of an intersection. Honks blared impatiently, yet no one dared to approach. Everyone knew whose car it was. The vehicle belonged to Adana Dlamini, the formidable CEO of Luminara Gems, one of the largest gemstone companies in Africa. However, one person didn't care about her reputation. Elijah, who happened to be passing by, noticed the stranded car and the woman standing beside it, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice calm yet confident. Adana turned, her sharp gaze scanning him. A young man in an old work shirt and worn-out jeans, his face streaked with sweat and oil. Yet, something in his eyes intrigued her. "You think you can fix this?" she challenged. Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crouched beside the car, lifting the hood to inspect the engine. After a few minutes, he straightened up and wiped his forehead. "Cooling system issue," he said. "I can fix it, but you'll have to wait about 15 minutes. Adana folded her arms. "If you can fix it, I'll buy you a cup of coffee." Elijah chuckled. "Sounds like a fair deal." 15 minutes later, the engine roared back to life. Adana pulled out her wallet, but Elijah shook his head. "I believe we had a different arrangement." Adana smirked, the first genuine amusement she had felt in a while. Instead of money, she reached into her purse and handed him a business card. "Come to this address tomorrow. I keep my word." With that, she drove off, leaving Elijah standing there, business card in hand, unaware that he had just assisted one of the most powerful women in the city. The next day, Elijah found himself standing in front of a towering glass skyscraper, Luminara Gems headquarters. He hesitated for a moment. The building's sheer grandeur made him feel out of place, but he took a deep breath and stepped inside. Inside, everything was polished and sleek, with employees in sharp suits walking briskly through the marble-floored lobby. He caught a few curious glances. After all, a young man in a simple button-up and worn jeans wasn't a common sight in this world. A receptionist escorted him to the top floor. As the elevator doors slid open, he was greeted by a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Standing by the window, her back turned to him, was Adana. She turned around, and for the first time, Elijah saw her not as the casually dressed woman from yesterday, but as someone entirely different. Clad in an elegant sapphire blue silk dress, her hair tied in a sleek, high ponytail, she radiated power. "You're punctual," she remarked. Elijah pulled out a chair and sat down, unfazed. "I don't like making people wait." Adana studied him for a moment before signaling for coffee. "How long have you worked at the garage?" she asked. Elijah took a sip of his coffee. "Since I was old enough to carry a wrench. It helps pay for my university tuition." Adana raised an eyebrow. "What are you studying?" "Automotive engineering," he said with a grin. "I want to open my own repair shop one day." A flicker of interest crossed Adana's face. "So, do you find it odd that I invited you all the way here just for coffee?" Elijah shrugged. "A little, but I assume you're someone important in this company." Adana leaned back, tilting her head. "You think I'm an employee?" Elijah met her gaze and smiled. "Aren't you?" Adana hesitated for a brief moment, then smirked. "Let's go with that." For some reason, she didn't feel the need to correct him. Elijah then pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "Can I have your number?" Adana looked at him, slightly taken aback. "You're asking for my number?" Elijah grinned. Coffee is one thing, but if your car ever breaks down again, I'd rather not rely on fate for our next meeting. For the first time in a long while, Adana laughed. She took his phone, entered her number, and handed it back. You're the first person to get my personal number without being a business associate. Elijah glanced at his phone, then back at her. Guess that makes me special then? Adana didn't reply, but there was an unmistakable glint of amusement in her eyes. A simple coffee meeting, a seemingly casual exchange. Yet, neither of them knew that this was only the beginning of something neither had ever anticipated. Ever since their coffee meeting, Elijah found himself constantly thinking about Adana. There was something about her, perhaps the way she carried herself, or the quiet but undeniable chemistry between them. He knew she was different from the women he usually met. She was strong, intelligent, and mysterious. Yet, despite her status, she had treated him with a kind of curiosity rather than arrogance. Sometimes, when he wiped the sweat off his brow in the repair shop, he found himself staring at the business card she had given him. He wondered if she would ever need his help again. On the other side of the city, Adana found herself equally distracted. She had met countless men in her life, wealthy businessmen, charming suitors, and ambitious CEOs. All of them polished, predictable, and, quite frankly, boring. But Elijah was different. There was an honesty in his words, a quiet confidence that didn't come from money or power, but from hard work and perseverance. And, though she wouldn't admit it out loud, he was handsome. For a man from the countryside, he had a remarkably well-built physique, broad shoulders, strong arms, and a posture that showed discipline and strength. She didn't realize how much she had been thinking about him until an opportunity to see him again presented itself. One morning, as she was going through her daily schedule, her driver approached her. "Ma'am, the Bentley needs an oil change. I can take care of it after I drop you off at work." Adana paused, then glanced at her reflection in the glass wall of her office. A small smile played on her lips. "No need," she said casually. "Take the day off. I'll handle it myself." Her driver looked surprised but didn't argue. And just like that, she had the perfect excuse to see Elijah again. Later that afternoon, Elijah was working on an old pickup truck when he heard the familiar low hum of a Bentley engine pulling up in front of the garage. He wiped his hands on a rag, squinting as the luxury vehicle came to a stop. His brows lifted slightly in surprise when Adana stepped out, dressed in a fitted white blouse and high-waisted slacks, looking effortlessly elegant. Elijah chuckled, tossing the rag onto the workbench. "Didn't expect to see you here." Adana closed the car door and approached him. "I need an oil change." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "And you decided to bring it here yourself?" Adana smirked, folding her arms. "I figured I'd check if my mechanic was still reliable." Elijah shook his head in amusement. "All right, let's take a look." As Elijah worked on the car, Adana leaned against a nearby workbench, watching him. "So," she said, tilting her head, "you're not curious why I came myself?" Elijah smirked but kept his focus on the engine. "Should I be?" Adana laughed softly. "Most people would be." Elijah straightened up, wiping his hands. "I figured you had your reasons. Maybe you wanted an excuse to see me again." Adana was caught off guard for a moment, but quickly recovered. "You're confident." Elijah met her gaze. "Just honest." Silence settled between them for a few seconds, comfortable yet charged with an unspoken tension. Adana glanced at his arms, noticing the way his muscles flexed slightly under his rolled-up sleeves. "You work hard," she observed. Elijah shrugged. "Comes with the job." Adana hesitated before speaking again. "How long do you plan on staying in this garage?" Elijah exhaled, looking at the horizon. "Until I save enough to open my own shop." Adana studied him for a moment. "And after that?" Elijah turned to her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Haven't thought that far. Maybe I'll figure it out over another cup of coffee?" Adana chuckled, shaking her head. "You really don't give up, do you?" Elijah grinned. "I just know a good deal when I see one." She rolled her eyes playfully but didn't disagree. As Elijah finished up and wiped his hands clean, he looked at her more seriously this time. "I don't know what kind of life you lead, Adana, but I get the feeling it's very different from mine." Adana nodded slowly. It is. Elijah tilted his head. Then why are you here? Adana exhaled, her lips curling into a soft, almost knowing smile. Maybe I just like watching you work. Elijah chuckled. Then I guess I'll have to make sure you keep coming back. Adana didn't reply, but she didn't deny it either. And for the first time in a long while, she found herself looking forward to the next time their paths would cross. The large conference room at Luminera Gem's headquarters was filled with an air of tension as Adana sat across from her father, Kwame Dlamini, a man whose presence alone could silence an entire boardroom. A powerful businessman, Kwame had built Luminera from the ground up, turning it into Africa's largest gemstone empire. He had always envisioned Adana as his successor, someone who would continue the family legacy. But that had never been her dream. Father, I've done everything you asked. Her voice was steady, but frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. I run this company. I make sure it thrives, but none of this fulfills me. Kwame folded his arms, his gaze sharp. And what would fulfill you, Adana? Throwing away your position to paint pictures? Adana clenched her jaw. Yes, painting is what makes me feel alive. This office? These meetings? They drain me. Her father scoffed. You are being childish. Do you think the world allows you the luxury of chasing dreams? You were born into responsibility, not fantasy. Adana felt a tightness in her chest, a familiar, suffocating feeling she had carried for years. I am not you, father. I don't want to spend my life drowning in profits and corporate strategies. Kwame leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Then tell me, Adana, if not Luminera, then what? Where would you go? Who would you become? She had no answer, because as much as she knew what she didn't want, she had no idea what life outside of her father's world looked like. Feeling exhausted, she pushed back her chair abruptly. I need air. And before he could stop her, she grabbed her coat and walked out of the office, her pulse racing with emotions she couldn't quite control. A night of escape. That evening, Adana found herself in a high-end bar, a place where dim lights and smooth jazz created the perfect atmosphere for forgetting reality. Her best friend, Lena, sat beside her, swirling a glass of red wine. So, your father still refuses to let you breathe? Lena asked knowingly. Adana sighed, rubbing her temple. He doesn't understand. He never will. Lena took a sip of her drink. You need a break, Adana. A real one. Run away for a while. Adana chuckled dryly. And go where? I don't even know what I'd do. Lena raised an eyebrow. You know exactly what you'd do. You'd paint. Adana hesitated, staring at her unfinished cocktail. Maybe. But she didn't finish her thought because Lena was already standing up, grabbing her bag. I need to head out. But you? You should call him. Adana looked at her friend, confused. Call who? Lena smirked. That mechanic. Elijah. Adana blinked. Why would I call him? Lena shrugged. Because you trust him. And right now, you need to talk to someone who won't judge you. Adana remained silent as Lena left, her words lingering. She stared at her phone for a long moment before finally dialing a number. Elijah was about to call it a night at the garage when his phone vibrated. Adana. A slow smile formed on his lips as he picked up. Miss me already? Her voice was softer than usual, lacking its usual playful edge. Are you busy? Elijah immediately picked up on the shift in her tone. Not really. What's up? There was a short pause before she finally said, Can you come? Elijah didn't need more details. Send me the location. I'll be there. 15 minutes later, Elijah walked into the bar, spotting Adana sitting alone at a private booth, a half-empty glass in front of her. She looked up when he approached, relief flashing briefly in her eyes before she masked it with a smirk. You're fast. Elijah sat down across from her. Figured you wouldn't call me just for a drink. She toyed with the rim of her glass. I had a fight with my father. Elijah leaned back. Must have been bad if it brought you here. Adana exhaled. It's the same argument we've been having for years. He expects me to run the company forever, but that's not what I want. Elijah tilted his head. Then what do you want? She hesitated before finally saying it out loud. I want to paint. Elijah's eyebrows rose slightly, But he didn't laugh or mock her. Instead, he simply nodded. So why don't you? Adana scoffed. It's not that simple. My family, my responsibilities. I can't just walk away. Elijah took a sip of water. Sounds to me like you're making excuses. She blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. Excuses? Elijah met her gaze. You say you want to be an artist, but all I hear is why you can't. Maybe the real problem isn't your father. It's that you don't believe in yourself enough to take the risk. Adana felt something tighten in her chest. No one had ever said it so plainly before. She had spent years blaming her father, but was she truly afraid of him? Or of failure? For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. What's stopping you from picking up a brush tomorrow? Adana exhaled, staring at her drink. Nothing, I guess. Elijah smirked. Then start. One painting. See how it feels. Adana studied him, her heart beating just a little faster. She had come here looking for comfort, but instead, she found clarity. For the first time, someone didn't tell her what she had to do. He simply asked her why she hadn't done it yet. And deep down, she knew he was right. She smiled softly. You're different, Elijah. Elijah chuckled. You keep saying that, but I'm just a guy who fixes cars. Adana shook her head. No, you're not. A moment of silence passed between them, filled with an unspoken understanding. For the first time, Adana had shared her personal struggles with someone outside of her world. And Elijah, he didn't try to fix her problems. He just listened. And maybe that was exactly what she needed. As the night stretched on, the drinks had begun to take their toll. Adana, though composed, was clearly tipsy. Her normally sharp eyes had softened, and her posture had relaxed against the booth's cushioned backrest. Elijah sat across from her, quietly observing. He had never seen her like this, unguarded, vulnerable, almost peaceful. She swirled the last of her drink in her glass before sighing. You know, I don't usually open up to people like this. Elijah smirked. I figured. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes drifting over him. You don't look at me the way other men do. Elijah raised an eyebrow. And how do they look at you? Adana exhaled, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Like I'm a trophy. Like I'm just my father's empire. Elijah's gaze softened. And how do I look at you? Adana held his eyes for a moment before she smiled. Like I'm just me. A flicker of something stirred in Elijah's chest. A warmth, an ache. Something that felt dangerously close to love. His grip on his water glass tightened slightly. Have I really fallen for her? The thought came uninvited, but once it was there, it refused to leave. Everything about Adana contradicted the world he knew. She was powerful, untouchable, someone who belonged to a completely different life. And yet, sitting here under the dim bar lights, she felt so real, so human. But could he ever be a part of her world? He glanced at his own reflection in the glass. A simple mechanic, a man of grease-stained hands and dreams built from sweat and labor. What did he have to offer a woman like her? Unless he became more. Right then, an idea formed in his mind. He had always planned to open his own shop one day, but what if he went beyond that? What if he learned business, strategy, and management, not just to run a garage, but to stand beside someone like Adana? If he studied business administration, he wouldn't just be a mechanic anymore. He could work with her, support her, understand her world from within. A slow determination settled into his chest. If I want to stand beside her, I need to step up. He didn't say anything out loud, but inside, he had already made his choice. Adana, now leaning her head slightly against the booth, let out a soft chuckle. What? Elijah asked. She shook her head lazily. I don't know. Tonight feels different. Elijah studied her for a moment before leaning forward slightly. Maybe because for the first time, you're letting yourself be real. She looked at him, her eyes half-lidded, but there was something genuine in her gaze. Elijah smirked. You should get home. Adana sighed. I know, but just a little longer. He chuckled. You're going to regret this in the morning. She gave him a playful glare. Don't remind me. Elijah reached for his phone and tapped the screen. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Preparing something," he said vaguely. Adana narrowed her eyes. "For what?" Elijah leaned back, a mysterious glint in his eyes. "For you." Adana smirked, raising an eyebrow. "That sounds suspicious." Elijah chuckled. "Maybe, but you'll have to wait to find out." She tilted her head, amused. "Is this your way of keeping me curious?" Elijah grinned. "Let's just say I'm working on something that might surprise you." Adana let out a breath, shaking her head. "You're impossible, Elijah." He simply smiled. "And yet, you keep calling me." Adana didn't deny it. And in that moment, Elijah silently promised himself, one day, he would stand beside her, not as a mechanic, but as an equal. Elijah was finishing up work at the garage when his phone buzzed. He wiped his hands on a rag before glancing at the screen. "Adana." A small smirk tugged at his lips as he answered. "Did my surprise arrive sooner than expected?" Adana chuckled on the other end. "Not yet, but I have a different reason for calling." Elijah leaned against the workbench. "Oh, and what would that be?" There was a brief pause before she spoke. "Spend Sunday with me." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Are you asking me on a date, Miss Dlamini?" Adana laughed softly. "You could call it that if you want. But really, I just want to go somewhere peaceful. No business, no expectations. Just us and a blank canvas." Elijah tilted his head. "You want to paint?" "I want you to paint with me," she corrected. Elijah smiled. "All right. Sunday it is." That Sunday, Adana picked him up in a more modest car. Her sleek Bentley was nowhere in sight. Instead, she had opted for a simpler, more practical SUV. She had dressed comfortably, in jeans and a soft sweater, her usual air of formality replaced with something much more natural. Elijah, in turn, had traded his oil-stained work clothes for a crisp white shirt and dark jeans, though his rough hands still bore the marks of his labor. The two drove out to the countryside, where rolling green hills and a shimmering lake provided the perfect backdrop for their day. Adana set up her easel and paints while Elijah spread out a blanket nearby. She handed him a brush, smirking. "Let's see if a mechanic can be an artist." Elijah chuckled. "I make no promises." As they painted side by side, the sun slowly drifted lower in the sky, casting golden hues over the landscape. At one point, Adana turned to look at Elijah, watching the way he focused on the strokes of his brush, his brows slightly furrowed in concentration. "You're actually taking this seriously," she mused. Elijah smirked. "If I'm going to be part of your world, I might as well understand it." Adana blinked, her brush pausing midair. "What do you mean?" Elijah set his painting down and reached into his bag, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. "Take a look." Adana unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. It was a business administration course registration. She looked up at him in surprise. You're taking a business class?" Elijah nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about my future, about where I want to be, and I realized, I don't just want to be your mechanic, Adana. I want to be your partner." Her breath caught in her throat. Elijah continued, his voice steady. "You love art. You deserve to paint without worrying about board meetings and financial reports. So, I'm going to learn how to help you run Luminera. That way, you can have your days in the office and your nights with your paintings." Adana stared at him, completely speechless. No one, not her father, not her employees, not even her closest friends, had ever thought about what she wanted. Yet here he was, a man who had started out as nothing more than a mechanic, willing to reshape his entire future just to give her the freedom she never had. Her fingers tightened around the paper, her heart swelling with emotions too complex to name. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice shaky. Elijah took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket. "That's not the only thing I wanted to give you today." Adana's eyes widened as he pulled out a small velvet box and got down on one knee. A proposal under the open sky. The world seemed as still as Elijah gazed up at her, the soft wind rustling through the trees. "Adana Dlamini," he began, his voice firm yet gentle. "I may not have been born into your world. I don't have wealth or power. But what I do have is a heart that belongs to you." Adana covered her mouth, her eyes already shimmering with tears. Elijah continued, I want to stand beside you, not just as the man who fixes your car, not just as the guy you call when you need an escape, but as the man who loves you, who will fight for you, and who will make sure you always have the time to chase your dreams. He opened the box, revealing a ring, not a massive diamond, not a symbol of status, but a beautifully crafted band with a single, perfectly cut sapphire, the color of the sky they had shared, the color of the dreams she had kept locked away. Marry me, Adana. Adana let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding. She had never imagined herself as the kind of woman who cried over a proposal, but here she was, standing in front of the only man who had ever truly seen her, feeling like the luckiest person in the world. She knelt down beside him, cupping his face with her hands. Yes, she whispered, her lips trembling into a smile. 1,000 times yes. Elijah grinned as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting them in a golden glow, Adana kissed him for the first time, sealing a promise that neither of them had ever expected to make. News of Adana Dlamini's engagement spread like wildfire through the corporate world. Her father, Kwame Dlamini, was furious. He had spent years shaping Adana into the perfect heir, expecting her to marry a powerful businessman, someone who could expand the empire, not a mechanic. The confrontation was inevitable. You're making a mistake, Adana, Kwame said, his voice cold as steel. This man has nothing to offer you. Adana stood tall, her engagement ring gleaming under the office lights. You're wrong, father. He's offering me something you never did. Kwame narrowed his eyes. And what is that? Adana smiled softly. Freedom. She turned to Elijah, who stood beside her, unwavering. Love. Elijah finally spoke, his voice steady. Mr. Dlamini, I may not come from wealth, but I am not a man without ambition. I am studying business so that I can help Adana, not just as her husband, but as her partner. I want to build something with her, not just inherit an empire, but shape a future together. Kwame stared at him for a long moment, then sighed heavily. You remind me of myself when I was young, he admitted begrudgingly. Stubborn, determined. Adana held her breath. I won't pretend to approve, Kwame finally said. But if you love my daughter, prove it. Elijah met his gaze without flinching. I already have. Kwame didn't argue further. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that Adana had chosen her own path, and he would have to accept it. A wedding unlike any other. Their wedding was nothing like a typical Dlamini affair. Instead of a grand ballroom filled with politicians and investors, Adana and Elijah chose a beautiful open field, where the sky stretched endlessly above them. Instead of silk tablecloths and golden chandeliers, there were fairy lights strung between trees and wildflowers woven into the wooden arch where they said their vows. Lena was Adana's maid of honor. Elijah's old mentor from the garage stood as his best man. And when they exchanged rings, Elijah whispered, This is the easiest decision I've ever made. Adana smiled, her eyes shining. Mine too. When they kissed, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, painting their future together, one brushstroke at a time. Epilogue, building a new legacy. Years later, Luminara Gems flourished under Adana's leadership, but not alone. With Elijah handling business operations, Adana finally found time to pursue her true passion. She opened her own art gallery, where her paintings hung proudly alongside the gemstones that had once trapped her in a life she never wanted. Their love story became legendary, not because of wealth or status, but because they had defied expectations and built a life where they could be both lovers and partners, dreamers and doers. And every Sunday, no matter how busy life became, they still found time for what started it all. A blank canvas, a brush, and each other.